Feminism has failed. It has failed to achieve its objective of creating an establishment based on female supremacy, because it has failed to persuade women that this is right. And it has failed at this because it has chosen the wrong view from a moral perspective in almost every possible point of contention. Feminism is just one aspect of contemporary liberalism. Both are ultimately doomed for the same reason, which is that people are naturally inclined to choose what is good when given sufficient opportunity. The less subjected a society is to the whims of an elite ruling class, the more certain that it will not create institutions based upon moral evils, which the social Marxist agenda most certainly is. What the far-left socialists have failed to comprehend is that their efforts are aimed at establishing such an elite ruling class, and that they are not it. If there is one thing that you can say for them, it's that they really do seem to think that they are engaged in an ideological war between good and evil, where the institutions that exist now have not been sufficiently democratized, so that further revolution is needed in order to make it so. If the history of the Marxist cause is any indication, the leftist lunatic fringe of millennial snowflakes who don't know how to sit down and be quiet, but think that it's their innate right to be given handouts from the state without working, can only reasonably expect either one of two things when their goals are complete: a short life without the means to survive, or an even shorter life ended by a bullet to the head. So detached are these would-be Bolsheviks of today from their ideological roots that the few remaining intellectuals among them have actually published Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America on the Marxist Internet Archive, as though the war which the Founding Fathers fought against tyranny and the system they created based on philosophy is the same as the one that Antifa and Femin are fighting now. I'm not even kidding, it's there, although I sincerely doubt that there's a single member of either of these groups who's ever heard of it. I find this most amusing. It was Tocqueville who first analyzed the separate spheres concept following the collapse of aristocratic rule in America, or, as the feminist would put it, the patriarchy. This is basically the view that women are biologically fitted to staying at home to raise children and take care of domestic affairs, while men are made to inhabit the social sphere. This was a situation which Tocqueville, the progressive of his day, found favorable. Quote, "I do not hesitate to avow that although the women of the United States are confined within the narrow circle of domestic life, and their situation is in some respects one of extreme dependence, I have nowhere seen women occupying a loftier position, and if I were asked to what the singular prosperity and growing strength of that people ought mainly to be attributed, I should reply, to the superiority of their women. If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Clearly, this stands in stark contrast to the liberal ideology of today. But that's what happens when your ideology is simply revolution for the sake of revolution. Eventually, you're bound to come full circle, or as Tocqueville put it, social frustration increases as conditions improve. As soon as you've killed off all the opposition, the tyranny of the majority takes over. Resentment builds against the privileges amassed by the dominant group, presently the professional victims, and the government squashes dissent. And that's what happened in America a full century and a half ago, which, incidentally, is when the African slaves were liberated by conservative white Christian men with guns. Just saying. The difference is that women were better off then than they are now. I mention it because it shows that the left's concept of revolution is a matter not of objective, but of perpetuity for the sake of perpetuity. But we live in a rape culture, and that proves that it's not a matter of the changes brought about by the left, but of the innate superiority of women being squashed by the patriarchy, which gave way to the superiority of women by Tocqueville's account. Of course, he didn't mean to say that women are superior to men, but that the women of America, in their defined roles, were superior to the women of Europe. But I'll concede that there has been, for a long time now, a de facto aristocracy in this country. However, this de facto aristocracy has only ever been kind to women in the way that feminists would see it, though admittedly unkind in the way that a rational person would. For example, the 19th Amendment was passed less than 6 years after the Federal Reserve Act. Believe me, the de facto aristocracy wants nothing more than for women to have all the so-called rights that feminists have sought over the last 100 years. It's fairly well known that Femin is funded by George Soros. Whatever it takes to topple the present regime and create perpetual conflict, that's what they're going to do. And speaking of Femin, feminists tell us that men are inherently sexual predators. It's in our genetic makeup or something. But then they ask, well, why don't you just teach boys to be respectful? To curb the imagined rape epidemic. Well, look at this. These women want, nay, demand your respect. Can you tell? You still have to be respectable to be respected. Boys are taught to be respectful in our culture and have been since the beginning of time. Yes, there is a rape culture. It's called Islam. Sweden, which was once the safest place in the world to live and boasted the highest standard of living anywhere on the planet, has been dubbed the rape capital of the world because of the liberal policies of the Swedish and European governments, which decided to turn it into a melting pot. Feminism has failed to protect women at the most fundamental level of basic awareness and of strategic alliance with the wrong groups, in this case the political bodies actively doing them harm. Ironically, nowadays, conservative white men for whom the idea of a rape is equally abhorrent, whether he imagines himself as the victim or as the culprit, are forced to endure mandatory one-sided sexual harassment classes at their places of employment, which are necessary to avoid the employer's liability in ridiculous lawsuits. They actually have an annual sexual harassment awareness certification program in the branch of military I was in, not to mention the government agency I used to work for, which they lump in with things like operational risk management training. And literally the only military customer courtesy that I'm aware of which has been completely dropped from the consciousness of military service members is the fact that a man in uniform used to be obligated to render a hand salute to a woman, civilian or otherwise. This is the equivalent of a gentleman tipping his hat to a lady, which, although it happens in movies about the Wild West, I can't say I've ever seen it. And there's a reason for that. Thanks to feminists, chivalry is now classified as sexual harassment. Men can and do lose their jobs, become registered sex offenders, and face all kinds of penalties and hardships because you're offended by the thought of romance. Well, what do you think these men are teaching their sons? Where do you think men going their own way came from? Those guys are fighting their own natural instincts to get the hell away from women because they've learned what the consequences of being in a bad relationship can be. It's a coping mechanism which survivors use to counteract the emotional trauma of being abused. And you know what else is another coping mechanism? This video and others like it. Yeah, I'm doing better than you, thanks for asking. I'm not the professional victim. The death of chivalry, or should I say, men no longer treating women the way that women would like to be treated, is not the fault of society or of men. That's the fault of feminists. You did this, feminists. Own it. By teaching women that they are all victims of imagined slights, to the point of actually instructing them about how they're supposed to be offended and by what, even in the most insignificant of ways, feminists disempower women. The process of victimization yields political gains to insincere claimants on a massive scale, but the process of creating a victim complex in the individual ensures and perpetuates suffering, especially where none is warranted. The idea that the definition of rape is inclusive of anything that triggers you just because you have a vagina is particularly odious to rape victims, who are no longer even seen as entitled to the special needs they require to recover as a group. Instead, the word rape has just lost its meaning to a large degree, and that's solely the fault of feminists who've insisted on pretending like it's so commonplace and a natural byproduct of masculinity. If you beat a screwdriver into the shape of a hammer and tell it it's a hammer every day, using negative reinforcement to make sure it can't escape its plight or return to its natural state, then eventually it's going to pound a nail. And if you go on and tell it that it's its fault for thinking it's a hammer and completely ignore the nail, but then try to claim the nail's plight as your own by some sort of loose association, you must be a feminist, because no one else does this. Feminism would be a lot more convincing if it was focusing its efforts on the plight of women in Muslim nations rather than on fart rape and manspreading. As it is, the true hypocrisy and disdain both for women and for the Western ideals, which have made conditions for women and everyone else the best in the world, couldn't be more evident in the activists who've taken to the streets to protest the democratic election of a man they've decided is a misogynist, going so far as to lambaste the women in his family by mere association. The success of the entire Trump family and their enterprise is largely due to the fact that when people call him names, he literally shrugs it off. And when they assault or try to assassinate him, he doesn't cry about it like a little bitch. Instead, he gives credit to the people protecting him and thanks them for putting their lives on the line. That kind of loyalty, which this inspires in the people supporting you, is why he has proved the master of political intrigue, which some of us always knew he was. And I'm talking about a man who never shrinks from controversy. The feminist rhetoric just isn't even worth his time. I think the reason he realizes this is that feminists have categorically proved beyond any reasonable doubt whatsoever that they are incapable of being reasoned with. I mean, it's not like the rest of us haven't figured that out. Contrary to the leftists' protestations, we're a year into the Trump era now, and the global economy is in a better state than it was before. The US hasn't nuked anybody yet, and no one, whether it be blacks, Muslims, women, or what have you, has lost any God-given or constitutionally protected rights. The only people who've suffered any adverse consequences are the people who without a doubt should, namely the corporate mainstream media, which lie through their teeth. And even this is only in terms of credibility and the monopoly on undeserved revenues which came with it, both of which were already waning anyway. Moreover, Trump has made good on his campaign promises, which is a first for any U.S. president in living memory, and which included making better trade deals with other countries. All it took was recognizing them as friends and partners instead of markets to tap into. This includes Muslim nations, by the way, as well as a communist country which other presidents from both major parties drained our economic and military resources on in order to destroy theirs. You'd have to be myopic indeed to not see that of the two options which Americans were presented, the one not courting the feminists has proved the better friend by far of women outside the U.S., despite his America First policy. I, for one, like the idea that Julian Assange is still alive and well, despite the sincerest efforts to get him on a fake sexual assault charge. And also that Chelsea Manning is out of prison. I dread the day when the next Hillary Clinton will come along and tie up those loose ends in the way most unfavorable to humanity. But even then, I'm hopeful that the madness is just done because sensible people have had enough, more than enough of it. Even would-be terrorist organizations like Antifa and Black Lives Matter are better off with Trump at the helm than any liberal, feminist or otherwise, as his mere existence in Washington has curbed the growing threats to the liberties which they depend on for theirs. And I understand the disappointment of not having their chosen candidate assume the mantle of puppet master. What I don't understand is how anyone can be so stupid as to think that better together means let's ass rape the half of the population that's fitting the bill for our opulence and call everyone who doesn't submit to it deplorable. Or to overlook her crimes against women and simultaneously think she's the one concerned about their well-being. And I'm not even talking about how she viciously attacked her serial rapist husband's victims as she stood by him in order to advance her own political career. I'm talking about the fact that she took hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes from Saudi Arabia through a foundation which is no longer operational due to its being exposed for human trafficking, and which thoughtlessly murdered a female journalist who tried to document that fact. I'm talking about the fact that she used her position in government to create the Islamic State, which, had it not been for the sober influence of men like her opponent, and the democratically elected president of Syria, whose overthrow she sought as a principal policy, not for the United States' benefit, but for Israel's, would have imposed Sharia law over untold millions of women. Seriously, not only she but also her supporters routinely cited her Saudi group appointment as Secretary of State as her major qualification. And why are these not even issues to feminists? Why do they talk about a guy making a remark about grabbing women by the pussy decades ago, but not the ongoing female genital mutilation which happens without anesthesia or consent? Might it have something to do with the source of the monies paying for the dissemination of the agenda? Better yet, why don't feminists just start fact-checking their claims? I'm sure that in all that data that's been compiled across the social sciences by all the well-funded feminists employed therein, they've probably got something there that could be used in support of their agenda, without their having to lie about it. If not, then we really need to start talking about intellectual dishonesty. All it would take to move the feminist movement in the direction of women's interests is a little bit of independent thought and a small measure of sincerity. Neither of which the feminists have any interest in, because for them it's all about broadcasting that they're in a cult. But had they a single moral bone in their body, they wouldn't just jump on board the political platform whose biggest selling point is the selective murder of unborn children, the acceptance and repetition of the licentious behavior that initiated it, and the abuse of coercive institutions to finance it with public funding. I remember laughing the first time I heard the term fart rape. Not just because it sounded like a joke to me, but because I had a hard time believing liberals were actually capable of reaching that far into the gutter of loathsomeness as to trivialize rape in such a despicable way. Likewise, if making the first move on a date by kissing your partner constitutes sexual assault, or telling someone you don't like her because of her sexual orientation constitutes hate speech, then the severity of these accusations has lost its meaning. And you can forget about private support for whatever reparations you think you're entitled to, regardless of the measure of public compliance, a fact which is destined to bite you in the ass at some point, and could actually end with women being treated worse in the future and forever after than at any time in history. Feminists and far-left liberals in general have created crimeless victims of women in order to make victimless actions prosecutable offenses. And in so doing, they haven't even thought it through to the inevitable conclusion. Either people will just stop caring, or else people will become so tired of it that there will eventually be a backlash, and later on, a reckoning. It's ironic that a Marxist can complain about having to fight Nazis again. They had the chance to quit while they were ahead, but now we've already seen the beginnings of a devastating backlash, which is only picking up momentum around the world. The reason many men in Europe are no longer afraid of being called racist is that their nations are literally being invaded by a hostile foreign entity, and their very way of life hangs in the balance. The liberals' policy in Europe has backfired so badly that Poles are marching by the tens of thousands in support of nationalism, chanting lines from Trump's speech of solidarity in Warsaw. Catalonia is inching near to independence from Spain and therefore the EU, never mind Britain. The revolution has only just begun. The real sleeping giant is in the United States, where the forgotten white man and his wife outnumber the female supremacist and her allies more than 2-1. And unlike the dykes and the beta males who cling to them, they own guns and they're breeding. As with the emboldened Europeans, the reason previously fence-sitting men in America are no longer afraid of being labeled misogynists, the reason that the feminist vitriol has lost its effect, is precisely that they have misapplied and overused the petty name-calling in order to create scandals and justify unreasonable hatred in place of civil debate over real issues. When the issues become real and important enough, men always tend to place more weight on the better argument, in other words, the ones which the facts support. But no feminist ever bothered an attempt to see things from a man's point of view, did she? And so they've failed utterly at adapting to men's expectations, or even to consider them at all. Like, it doesn't even matter what men think. The truth is, we have been on the course of decentralization of power and the democratization of society since at least the signing of the Magna Carta. And it was only a matter of time before women would have had the same rights and privileges as men. So feminists may claim to have been instrumental in this outcome, but we'll never really know, since it would have happened anyway, with or without their influence. Women have always wielded more power over men through the ear given them by their husbands and other close acquaintances, and the same remains true today. Whatever gains for women's interests could rightly be attributed to the feminist movement are scant compared with the losses I've described. Sure, there was a time when women had it rough, or rather, that everybody did. Disease was ravaging the Americas and Europe. The Mongols were killing Chinese people by the tens of millions. That's how the modern era began. Women do seem to have had it worse. But that changed well before feminism came along. I get that it's insulting to someone who thinks that her vote would matter to be barred from voting for representative government. But it doesn't really take a genius to realize that it doesn't matter. While the belief that it does is the real means of oppression and mechanism of enslavement in our society. And I know that as a man with a sense of duty informed by the standard of right and wrong, I would have been likely to have answered the call to arms during some period of struggle in the past. So I think that being a woman probably sounds more appealing back then. I can only imagine what kind of PTSD my grandfather had that caused him to never even speak about his fortunate survival in a war that left him hospitalized and his comrades all dead on the battlefield. Even though the fact that I donned the same military uniform was what comforted him when his life was expiring. It's been like that for many vets in many parts of the world throughout history. And I know that the horrors of war aren't exclusive to men. But I think it really helps to put things into perspective. We men have never even been allowed to talk about the problems which leave us crippled in defense of the nations and the families we love, if not dead. To do so would be to display our weakness, to be antisocial, to alienate people, and to be ostracized rather than helped. And it's like that on a wide spectrum of psychological issues beginning in our infancy. But we survived through it, and we've survived throughout the ages because it teaches us to adapt and overcome, not to be victims. Women have done this too, throughout history. Suffering just tends to make people stronger. Feminism, on the other hand, turns women into perpetual professional victims. Rather than empowering them to rise above their circumstances, women who espouse feminist beliefs without scaling the competitive corporate ladder are liable to succumb to it. And that's most people, men and women alike. It may be that someday some women will be poised to be elevated to positions in business that they wouldn't have without feminism. But at what cost? A few women joining the ranks of the 1% does not justify forcing the rest to live the same hard life which men have known throughout the ages. And I don't mean to say that women haven't had it hard. But you don't see them working the same jobs in coal mines and roofing and, dangerous things. Women who don't either become vicious man-haters or sluts are compared and contrasted with feminists very favorably in the minds of good men who seek good women as companions, and then this creates a vicious circle. The feminists become increasingly jealous and spiteful of the more virtuous and feminine women, whom they see as happier with their wiser decisions, which they interpret as privilege. And this privileged status causes the feminists to hate them even more. So the more they exude this hate both against them and against the men they love, for no good reason, the more that women see them as a threat to womanhood. It's like every feminist is in a perpetual state of stupor. For some reason, they just can't see how vile they are because they're constantly projecting their sociopathic musings onto others. At best, the ultimate goal of radical feminism is to destroy the bonds between men and women, at best. And this takes away from women the one thing that is most likely to make them happy, for which there is no substitute: the requited romantic love of a husband. Not all men are good, and not all husbands are loyal to their wives or good to their wives. And not all good men want to settle down and raise a family. But every man knows when he's found a good woman who's worth the trouble of winning over and who's worth hanging on to. The perception of women which feminism aims to give men doesn't just lower the standard, it reduces it to nothing. And while the feminists may cheer that they've made themselves unattractive and undesirable to the opposite sex, the vast majority of women will simply never get on board with this struggle against nature and against the biological drive to produce children, any more than men as a whole will stop finding natural women attractive and wanting to mate with them and have them as companions. Historically, when the feminist notion of the patriarchy have been most akin to the reality of the interplay between men and women, the aspirations of men to seek this companionship and leave a legacy in their children have actually been at their height, which is the opposite of what the theory that men are all self-serving narcissists would predict. If nothing else, the moral institutions led by men that most feminists would view as being the most antithetical to their interests, and I mean the Christian establishment, are the ones which have protected women's interests throughout history by accentuating the innate capacity of men to remain celibate and also ensuring monogamous matrimonial relations, which are far more to the benefit of women than to men, with or without civil penalties for divorce, which have perhaps become feminism's greatest success to the end of making women as a privileged class through institutional discrimination practices. The state has replaced both the husband and the master, which is to say God. But the toll which this policy has taken on society as a whole is enormous. 9 out of 10 welfare recipients are single mothers. But because the state is willing to force the taxpayers to shoulder the burden, and because the taxpayer has no recourse, and because the welfare recipient has no incentive not to change her lifestyle, but each new baby she produces is another stipend, the left has created a massive economic bubble which will ultimately bankrupt the entire tax and spend system. And all these welfare mothers are going to be left without support, and their kids are going to die off. And this begs the question of whether it's better to be on welfare or to be married, not just for the sake of the welfare recipient, but for society as a whole, and therefore all women. Let's be honest. As it is now, women have privileges which men don't, but they don't even know how to make use of them because they've been told that they're entitled to them and to much more also. I've been told bluntly that I wouldn't be given a job application, never mind the job, just because I wasn't the right sex. Even as a man, I probably could have filed a civil rights lawsuit claim, but I don't believe that it's right to sue a business for doing what the business owner thinks is in the best interests of the business. Like many other vets and many other men, I've suffered abject poverty and homelessness and absolute rejection by society. And to be honest, it wasn't all that great, but it was certainly liberating. No one has ever been able to tell me that I'm not who I am or take away my dignity. Looking back, I realized that the biggest part of that was refusing to ask for handouts. I was much happier to endure the vicissitudes of fate than to let the government be my master. Being born without privileges, I had to earn every single thing that I ever had a claim to, and I'm better off for it. But had I been a woman, I would have had more opportunities, and I don't know what I would have done. I don't know if I would have made the same decisions. How many women are stuck in that situation precisely because they listened to the peers and politicians who sold them a piece of fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? In the end, Eve wasn't like the gods, and she did die. Feminism would have it that lesson never be learned. In fact, my first real run-in with the existence of the radical feminist movement was with its choosing Lilith as one of its symbols. If you don't know, Lilith was the first wife of Adam, according to Jewish folklore. But she refused to obey her husband or something, and so she was sent away. By teaching women to hate men, feminists are causing women to be hated in return. Women are generally more codependent and susceptible to depression than men, so this affects women more disproportionately. This is known from psychological research. This also creates a vicious circle. The more animosity, the more hate. The more hate, the more animosity. Feminists need to realize that if they're ever going to come around to having any sort of clearly defined goals, as they did during the first two waves, and they also want to see them materialize, then they're going to have to stop preaching a message of hate, intolerance, and entitlement, while hypocritically insisting that it's really all about tolerance, equality, and social justice. If this cycle is ever going to end, they're going to have to start behaving like rational adults. I know they're capable. After all, they are all women or men or children, and thus endowed with the same capacity for sense and reason as the rest of us. But someone told them that they're special because of their status, and not that equality means that we're all equally special because we're all children of God, or citizens of the state, or whatever. It's a shame that one child can say to another, "Stop oppressing me," while she's making the case for murdering her own child and claiming his body and his life as her own. A great many of us are conscious enough to see why this isn't right logically, whether or not we agree that she should be allowed to make such a decision due to moral, ethical, religious, or humanitarian concerns. It's hard, and you might even argue insane, to convince oneself that it's right to treat this person as an innocent, helpless victim. In fact, it's hard to see any virtue in the ideology so devoid of any kind of basic moral compass. Even the minority of atheists in America will argue that they're moral and that they live virtuous lives. How can you insist that your ideology is the right one for others to espouse when it's rooted in false claims but not in any kind of rational appeal to religious or civic virtue? And we all have a basic sense of virtue. We're all aware of the standards of decency. Every culture which has survived to the present has had some notion of the golden rule enshrined in its ethical constitution. What we need to learn is to get along with each other. It's not rocket science. It's not something you can legislate or cause to come about by screaming at civilized people attending peaceful demonstrations. Radical feminism will never get from men what women want, because what women want is to be loved, and feminism only breeds contempt and animosity. We simply need to love each other and treat each other with honor and respect the way we're designed to naturally. I'm pretty sure I read that in that book, which feminists think is the source of their oppression. It used to be that way back when people had no consciousness of this thing called the patriarchy. I'm pretty sure getting back to that is feasible. And in the meantime, if you want to be a slut or reap the rewards of being seen as one, that's up to you. But you have absolutely no right to force it on others.